Hey everybody, welcome back into another episode of Learning Jazz Language. Got a fantastic episode for you today with the great Michael Thomas. You guys are going to love this episode. Just wanted to pop on real quick and let you know that during the interview when Michael was playing saxophone, I was hearing it beautifully. Turns out the recording, not so much. So most of his playing examples in the episode will be fine. You'll be able to hear everything. But every now and again, the microphone cuts out. There wasn't much I could do about this. But you are still going to get so much out of the lessons that Michael was gracious enough to teach us. And I hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to another episode of Building a Jazz Vocabulary. And this time we have one of my favorite saxophonists and composers, all around great player and great guy, Michael Thomas. Thanks for being on, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
So is vocabulary something that you're working on every day in the practice room? I mean, I follow your Instagram and you show a lot of your process. And it seems like vocabulary is something that you're working on every day. Is it something you do all the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to that is yes. I think the longer answer is sort of defining what vocabulary means to you as a musician, because I know, like, for some people that may be practicing a diminished pattern, or it may be practicing, a line that you could play over a 2/5, or how you might approach a particular type of chord. For me, I think practicing vocabulary is often about becoming familiar with different sounds. So like one of the things I talk often about with my students is the idea that a scale is not an order of notes the way we're often taught in 5th or 6th grade. It's a set of notes. So if you talk about the F major scale, it's a set of 7 notes, and you can sort of do an infinite number of things with those notes. So the more familiar you are with the content at the most fundamental level, the more opportunities you'll have to create your own vocabulary when you're improvising. So a lot of my practice is centered around finding new ways to use existing material.
So what are some of those ways? Because that is a lot to think about, what you just said. It's a collection of notes and not an order. So how do you give yourself more access to those notes in different ways?
Well, so one of the things that I like to do, and this is sort of a process that I learned when I was studying with Jerry Bergonzi at New England Conservatory, but just to think about all the different combinations of intervals. So let's say the F major scale, D major on alto. That's how most students start when they say, okay, I'm going to learn this scale. I'm going to practice this scale. But then you start breaking it down and, can you play it in thirds, in fourths, in fifths? Can you play triads, 7th chords? Can you play the inversions of the triads or the 7th chords? Can you play fourths voicings? That's one that I've been practicing recently. So stuff like that. And what I'm really doing is I'm taking, maybe the way that McCoy Tyner would voice, diatonic voicings in the key of F, and I'm just expanding that into a linear concept on alto, and it's the same with, if I practice 7th chords, et cetera, full range. But then you start getting really familiar with that material, and you can do variations of it. So it's something that Coltrane would play, for example. Stuff like that, where it's you're putting a leading tone to the 7th of each 7th chord. But for me, all of these things, out of what I just played, the last one I think sounds the most like jazz vocabulary. But for me, a lot of it is more approachable in that sense if you've broken down these building blocks and really explored what the material has to offer. And then you can say, oh, I could play this not just as a diatonic scale, but as a bebop scale. Or I could play this, with a leading tone, or I could play it in inversions, or I could cycle it this way or that way. And for me, like getting back to the idea of vocabulary, the creative process of deciding what these ideas are and how to practice them comes from listening and transcribing. And going back to some of the stuff that I often talk about with my students, I think a lot of young players start transcribing for the wrong reason, because they want to learn somebody's vocabulary. They want to learn Sonny Stitt's vocabulary. And yes, like that is a worthy pursuit, but I think the mental approach to it is often wrong. Because if you listen to, like one of my favorite Sonny Stitt records, as an example, is the one with Oscar Peterson's trio. For me, that's like the pinnacle of alto playing. Like in that style, like nobody did it better than that. And if somebody said, well, what do you love about that? I would say I love the time feel, the sound, the clarity, the phrasing. But none of those things are, oh, I love the line he played on the bridge on the second chorus of, I'll Remember April, which is probably a killing line, but I'm not thinking of it in these like sort of microscopic things where I'm going to take a line and, dissect it and put it through all the keys, and then that's something that I could play. I'm trying to transcribe from the perspective of how do I evoke the same feeling or the same emotional content as the person that I'm studying. So, a lot of the time with transcriptions, I don't even write them down. I just kind of learn it by ear and I try to absorb it. And once I can play the solo, I move on. And I might spend, there was a time a few years ago that I decided I needed to learn that record. And I spent a few months learning all the alto solos on that record. Nice. And just by doing that and like living that language, I was able to play more of that vocabulary. But again, the analysis kind of happens of like, okay, I'll Remember April in alto. It starts in the key of E major and then it goes to E minor. Right. So what is he doing with E major that makes it sound like him? That's different than the way Cannonball played that tune, different than the way Dexter Gordon played that tune. So I think the more time you spend studying, scales and harmonic situations and just sort of expanding on these possibilities of how to practice, you're going to have a better idea of how to incorporate the stuff you're hearing and transcribing. And then you're also just going to have better command of the instrument and better command of your ears. And that's something that I also talk about a lot, is that when we're on the bandstand and we're improvising with other musicians, the idea is that you want your reaction time to be as close to zero as possible. Okay. Somebody plays something and you can respond to it without thinking about it. And you're doing it all in real time. And I think from practicing things like diatonic exercises, symmetric scale exercises, chromatic patterns, any of that stuff, you're developing a stronger connection between your brain and your ears and your fingers. And when you have that, for me, at least, it's almost like the vocabulary takes care of itself. And I'm thinking not about playing certain vocabulary, but, oh, this is the melody I want to play in this moment.
Yeah. And what's the most important aspect of that? Because I love that way of thinking, right? And you mentioned, it's like brain, fingers, ears, like those would be three aspects of being able to play any vocabulary you want, or as you put it, any melody that you want. Right. Is there like a most important? I mean, is it the ears, or is it the mastery of the instrument, or are they all equal in the way that they work together?
For me, they're all equal, but I do think that they're equal once you've mastered the instrument. Okay. So, and I mean, that's a lifelong pursuit. And it's the reason that, every day I start my practice session with, 30 minutes of long tones, just so that when I go to perform, I know that I'm in control of what's going to come out of the instrument.
Right.
Then my brain is free to think about the creative process and make those musical decisions and not be distracted by, oh man, my sound kind of sucks today.
Right. I love there's a Kenny Werner quote where he says, like, I never got done with a gig and said, oh man, I wish I had less technique.
Right.
It
Right.
doesn't
And
happen.
I think it's one of those things where like often, and I don't, maybe not so much now, but like I know when I was in college, to a certain extent, there were players that were looked down on because they had a lot of chops,
Mm.
Mhm. And it could have also just been, the scene that I was in when I was in school, but I always kind of questioned that logic. It's like, well, yeah, okay, Chris Potter has a lot of chops, but like, isn't that great? Like he can play anything he wants, anytime he wants, and he can play it perfectly the first time. Like,
Right.
isn't that our goal? Even if you don't want to play what he's playing,
Yeah.
because maybe his musical choices are not your preference, or maybe for some people it's an acquired taste. But to sort of strive for that type of instrumental ability and mastery, I think it's only going to serve you better as an improviser, because you can
Right.
always choose not to play a lot of notes,
Totally.
or if you're somebody like me who tends to play a lot of notes, you can get better at expressing yourself that way so that you're not playing extraneous notes,
Right.
And that was kind of an interesting thing that a friend of mine pointed out when we were in grad school. Great tenor player, Mike Tucker.
Oh yeah, I love Mike
Yeah,
Tucker.
yeah, he's one of my favorites. But we went to NEC together for our masters, and one day I was like, yeah, I feel like I play too many notes, and he was like, well, who do you listen to? And I started naming like Michael Brecker, Chris Potter, Dave Benny, Mark Turner, and he was like, dude, you like players that play a lot of notes. Just get better at playing a lot of notes.
Mm.
You like that's your thing, and you just haven't really like figured it out yet. Like, don't not do your thing.
Right.
And I think that was kind of an important conversation for me in my development, because it was like, oh, I need to figure out how I want to play and then figure out how to do the best version of that.
Mm.
I shouldn't do something because somebody else says to do it this way or that way. And I think even from a vocabulary standpoint, maybe you really love bebop, or maybe you really love pentatonic language, or maybe you really love triad pairs or whatever. But like if that's a sound that you gravitate to, whatever it is, really get inside that sound and explore it as much as you think. Because to me, vocabulary is how you express yourself. It's not playing a specific type of language. Like McCoy had his own vocabulary, Joe Henderson had his own vocabulary, Woody Shaw had his own vocabulary, same as Don Byas had his own vocabulary, or Lester Young, or Charlie Parker, and I think that's really what it comes down to, is like, who are you as an artist, and what are you trying to communicate, and what musical ideas or concepts will allow you to communicate that most easily and most clearly.
That is such great advice. And sometimes it's just hard to have the courage to not work on what you've been told to work on, or what you think you should be working on, instead of sort of like you said, going down that path of like, what really turns you on musically?
Right,
Okay, go and
exactly.
explore that.
Yeah. And I think, sort of the devil's advocate to that is, if you want to be a great musician, you do have to check out those other things that maybe aren't your favorite. And I mean, for me, for a long time, bebop was not my favorite. It was just not the sound that I heard when I was improvising. But then when I finally had a teacher who said, you need to learn this, and you need to like get deep into it and learn how to play tritone subs,
Yeah.
and get better at rhythm changes and all that stuff, all of a sudden I was able to play better the way I wanted to play, because I was just, again, expanding what I could hear, what I could think of, playing things I hadn't dealt with on the instrument before.
Yeah.
So, ultimately play your own stuff, but on the journey to that point, play everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a similar experience where I had a teacher that realized I couldn't play bebop and would make me write a full page of just G7 every week for my lesson. And
Yeah.
I just remember how bad it was at the start and how much I didn't want to be doing it. And then as the process went on, I realized how valuable it was. And yeah, it taught
Yeah.
me to
And I
do
think,
something that I was bad at.
yeah, and that actually reminds me, when I was younger and like really trying to apply a lot of conceptual stuff, I would pick a tune and I would write a solo on that tune. And I would say, okay, I'm going to write 2 choruses on Stella by Starlight, and I'm only going to use triad pairs on
Cool.
each chord, but I'm going to try to make it not sound like triad pairs.
Right.
Or I'm gonna write uh 2 choruses of rhythm changes, and on the bridge I'm gonna only use tritone subs, and I'm gonna, I would pick something like that. Or I'm gonna write a solo on There'll Never Be Another You and try to use as many fourths as possible.
Cool.
So that way it's like the concept, and it sort of goes back to what Wayne Shorter used to talk about how composition is just improvisation slowed down.
Right.
And improvisation is just composition in real time.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you say, okay, I want to practice fourths, if you're looking at it and visualizing it and putting it on the page and really like composing that, you are creating vocabulary and you're internalizing it through that process.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can start taking some of your own ideas and say, okay, well, maybe this is one that I want to like turn into an exercise.
Yeah.
Or maybe this is one that I never want to hear again, and it's all part of the process. And you learn to like distill the information that you want from an exercise like that and turn it into a million different things.
Yeah, and I think it also helps to be really heavy-handed with something, because how else are you going to absorb the sound of that?
Right.
And if you're writing your own exercises, these are not things you're going to go out and play in public. So yeah,
Right.
go ahead and use the same thing every opportunity you can, and then
Exactly.
worry about being more balanced later.
Yeah.
Nice.
So,
That's great advice. I love that. So, how has your process of working on vocabulary and language like changed over the years? What does that look like?
so for me, I guess maybe if we sort of work backwards, like recently I've been working on trying to hear things more quickly. So
Okay.
like if I think of a line or a shape, and I think a lot of it came from when I started writing more for big band, and I'm like staring at a score for hours and hours and hours, but I'm seeing everything vertically.
Mm,
So it's like I'm looking at what I wrote for 4 trumpets and 4 trombones, and I'm thinking, oh, that would sound kind of cool if I played it from the bottom up, and then, okay, what would that sound like if I played that, cycling through this or through that? So for me, a lot of the time, like, let's say I take a simple structure or something like that, like maybe like 1, 2, 5, 7 or something like that. Like, and that's another thing, I think in numbers all the
right.
time.
Okay.
So like it 1, 2, 5, 7, no alterations. That just to me implies like notes from the major scale.
Okay.
So if I were to play that from low C on saxophone, right? So you could think of that different ways. It's a triad from 5 inverted
Right.
over 1, or it's like a major 9 chord with no third.
Right.
But you've got a shape like that. So for me, and this is actually something that I got from watching a masterclass that Michael Brecker gave sometime in the 90s, somewhere in the Midwest. It's on YouTube.
Cool.
I'll try to find a link and send it to
Yeah,
you.
I'll find it and post it.
Yeah.
Cool.
But he talks for like 2 hours, and one of the things he talked about in that was taking an idea and playing it through all the intervals, meaning like playing it in half steps, in whole steps, minor thirds, major thirds, and fourths. And he would typically practice anything through those combinations. So if I play, going up in half steps versus going up in whole steps. It's got a totally different sound.
Right.
And I always start with half steps because it's like, okay, you might as well learn it full range of the horn, whatever it is. But then once you know it, it's like your muscle memory is getting you through the phrase and your brain is telling you where to start each time. So minor thirds, major thirds, and then going back down.
Right.
So that you're really getting every combination. But then, are you getting every combination?
Right.
Have you played it backwards?
Yep.
Right. Have you played it forwards and backwards, or backwards and forwards? So that would be the next step is something like that, and then going down. And then cycling, so up one and down the next.
Right.
Stuff like that, where I have no intention to play that when I'm improvising.
Right.
But through thinking this way and practicing this way, again, it sort of goes back to my idea of reducing my reaction time on the bandstand. And a lot of the time that reaction time is even to the things that I'm playing. Like if I play a certain phrase or a certain interval, like what do I hear next? And how long does it take me not just to know what I'm hearing in my head, but to actually put that on the instrument?
Awesome.
So
such great advice and like great demonstrations. And I mean, the other cool thing about what you just did is you could come up with, endless, infinity amount of patterns and just practice it that way.
Right. And I mean, that's a big part of what I do is just, okay, here's some numbers. What does it sound like? And if it's a sound that's cool to me, then cool, I'm going to explore that. Or maybe it's not even that cool sounding, but it's like especially challenging mentally, and then it's strengthening that aural, mental, physical connection that we were talking about.
Right.
But a lot of this, like if I look back to when I first started developing, language, vocabulary, I kind of started where everyone starts. I mean, I think the first 2-5 that I learned in all the keys, something like that. And it's like completely diatonic. If you know your major scales, it's very approachable to play it in all the keys.
Yeah.
And I would literally play a tune and say, okay, on Take the A Train, I'm gonna play that every time I have a 2-5.
Right.
And it's sort of the opposite of what I'm doing now, but in terms of hearing clarity, I think it's really important to start with something like that if this is new for you.
Right.
Because if you don't know what it feels like to play the correct sound on a chord, then you'll never intuitively play those sounds.
Right.
So, and it's similar, like a tune that we've all practiced for 1,000 hours is Giant Steps. And the way you practice that is by playing the same thing on every chord until you know the sound of the tune. like 1 2 3 5 or
Right.
1 2 3 1, or or some arpeggio phrase. And a lot of people call those melodic cells,
Right.
which I think is really important to practice as well, because it's just like these little fragments that you could use, you could edit, adjust, invert, however you want to use it. But the more things you can do, the more ways you'll be able to apply that language. And it's like for example, 1 2 3 5 is sort of inherently melodic. If I play that in the key of C, right, we all know that sound.
Yep.
But because it's inherently melodic, you could play it on any scale degree. And then it's like you've got something that's diatonic, you're playing in the key of C major, but you're not limited to just playing notes in the chords. You're not limited to just outlining the chord, or using these cells more creatively. I think that's something that a lot of students would benefit from exploring, or like I was talking, like diatonic triads or seventh chords. And then there's rhythmic variations, because a big part of what I do, and this is something I actually started working on probably more than 15 years ago, because I was definitely working on this in my undergrad. But a lot of the players I like, if you start trying to notate their solos, it's not eighth notes, it's not 16th notes, it's not triplets, it's something else. And you can always figure out what that thing is, right? And you can calculate, it's 17 notes and 3 beats or whatever.
Right.
And I think there actually is a lot of value in that, just from like a mental angle, and like really understanding what you're playing.
Yeah.
And also in performing a transcription, if like this takes 3 beats to play these notes, however many notes it is, exactly what your target is, and it's going to be easier to evenly space an unusual phrase.
Yeah.
But taking something simple like diatonic triads, like if I do it, I don't know, like F melodic minor, that would be like just triplets. If I was a little better prepared, I would have a metronome here and do it with
worries.
a metronome. But like, okay, say you get bored of playing it in triplets. What are some other ways you could do it? Right. So then you're playing a group of 5 instead of a group of 3, because you're going up and back down.
Right.
And all of a sudden it's like it changes your ability to flow rhythmically with your ideas, or like even going, let's say you were doing 7th chords. Doing a group of 7, or triad pairs. That's something that a lot of people are working on, something I've sort of been revisiting recently. Let's say we took like one of the triad pairs from that scale, so like I guess I would think of it as C augmented and B flat major. So right, and you can go through the inversions, but then you could apply the same concepts. So you start getting these things that have a little bit different flow to them. I think maybe one of the first players who really kind of explored that was Joe Henderson. Like he had a way of playing very much in time without playing rhythms that you could say, oh, he's playing triplets on the 3rd beat. It was and to me, it's also more like the way you would think about rhythm when you're speaking. Like there's a natural cadence to it but you're not thinking about speaking in eighth notes or something like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Joe Lovano comes to mind as like
Yeah,
a master of that. You know,
yeah,
he's just speaking to you through the horn. It's amazing.
yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned Lovano, because one of his big influences, at least the way I hear it, is Ornette,
Mm.
who
Hmm.
also does this, but without playing a lot of notes. But it's very much like, oh, here's an idea,
Yeah,
and here's another new idea, and
yeah,
he's sort of like handing you these things and telling you to listen to them without thinking, oh, this is organized this way or that way.
right.
um, and again, none of this is stuff that I set out to play when I take solo, but if you practice these things, then it just sort of happens naturally,
Right,
you know, so that
right.
you have your own sound and your own approach.
That's beautiful, man. Well, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I mean, you've given me personally so many things to think about, going into the practice room. And I wanted to let everybody know that Michael actually has a book that's very much related to how he builds his vocabulary. And I'm assuming how you teach a lot of your students. It's called Patterns for Technical and Aural Development. Can you say a few words about that before we wrap up here?
Yeah, so I guess maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I started to be more active on social media, and I thought,
Mhm.
I'll just share some things that I'm practicing. And almost immediately people were like, "Oh, can you write that down?" And my first thought was, I just played it. What do you need it written down
Right,
for?
right.
You
Yep.
could learn it.
Hmm.
But then I realized that if I sort of put it together correctly, it maybe could benefit a lot of people. So what I did was, basically, there's 200 phrases in this
Oh, cool.
book,
Hmm.
and I gave the student as little information as possible. And then I said, like, it starts here and you take it up to this and you go back down, but then you also have to start on this note,
Mm.
because, and that was my initial hesitation with writing a book of this stuff, is that, like, maybe one of the first ones was like the Oliver Nelson patterns for jazz,
Hmm.
which I actually practiced all of that stuff, like, sort of religiously in high
Yeah.
school. And I thought a lot of it sounded awesome, because it does.
Right.
um, but you work out of a book like that, and to me it becomes more of a sight reading exercise,
Right.
because everything is written out. And it sure, it sounds great, and if you practice it, there is some stuff that you'll absorb, and maybe you'll start using some of those phrases in your own improvising. But with my book, I wanted it to be more about ear training and understanding the concept,
Hmm.
so that it would then be easier for the student to come up with their own variations, rather than seeing something concrete and saying, oh, this is how you play this phrase.
Yeah.
It's like, well, figure out the phrase, and then, because you're figuring it out, you might also stumble on some of your own stuff along the way.
That's great.
um, so it's 200 lines in this book, and it's not really in any order. I think when I started writing it, I maybe thought it was going to be, but then it was like, you could just open this up and say, today I'm going to do 137,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
that's part of your practice, and maybe some of them are more difficult than others.
Yeah.
So, I've talked to some people who said, oh, I spent, a week working on the first page,
Yeah.
or you know, like, these variations are really tricky. I spent a while working on those, and it's something that you can do at your own pace.
Cool.
But just some ideas and some stuff that maybe you haven't played before.
That's beautiful. And I know there's going to be a lot of sax players watching, but is it for any instrument, basically?
Yeah, so it
Okay.
works on any instrument.
Great.
It is not saxophone specific, although I will say, being a saxophone player, everything is written to the range of the saxophone.
Okay.
So, like, low
Gotcha.
B flat to high F sharp on the page.
Cool.
But if you play trumpet, it's a guideline. And the idea is that you play everything the full range of your instrument. So
Beautiful.
you figure out what the pattern is and you start on low F sharp instead. Um, but yeah, any instrument. It's in treble clef. So if you're a bass clef person, just read it and think about it, because it's not a reading exercise anyway.
Right, right. I was gonna say even better. You have to do some work before you can even play the beginning of
Yeah, exactly.
it.
So, but yeah, it's about the process,
Cool.
and there's a few pages written introduction that sort of explains in more detail how to use it and why to use it. Um,
Beautiful.
so
Well, everybody make sure you go and check that out. I'll put a link to that in the description below this video. And just want to say thanks, Michael. Thanks for taking the time out to talk to us and really enlightening us on how you think about vocabulary.
yeah, thanks for having me.